Dame Elizabeth Corley is chair of the Impact Investing Institute, and she joins me now. Can we start by talking a little bit about what the aims and objectives of the Institute are?
Yeah, sure, Mark, and thanks for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. So the Institute basically aims to mobilise capital that has an impact. Now that sounds really simple. You could argue that all capital has an impact, but this is around mobilising intentional capital. So you say from the beginning, this is what we intend to happen with this capital. And that could be outcomes for people, social outcomes, or it could be outcomes for the planet, environmental outcomes. And our goal is to mobilise as much private capital as we can, which is intentionally focused on positive outcomes for people or planet.
So the primary objective of this impact is, as you said, something like a social impact, like providing more education. How important is the financial impact in terms of returns to shareholders?
Well, that's a great question. You can actually dial up or dial down the importance of financial returns. So a lot of what we focus on is what's called finance first. So imagine that you're moving from traditional ESG investing and you're starting to think about having more intentional outcomes. You want more measurable outcomes, but you still want a financial return within your risk budget. So that's called finance first impact investing. So we focus a lot on that. As you move further on, you can dial up the amount of impact and you can say, well, actually, I don't want to lose my money, but I want more impact. And you gradually move from intentional finance first to what's ultimately called impact first, where you're saying, as long as I get my money back, I want this impact and I'm less worried about return. So you can go across that spectrum of returns and impact.
There's quite a lot of interest in impact investing, ESG, sustainability in the last few years. There's a huge number of trade bodies, industry initiatives, Climate Action 100, PRI, there's UN SDGs, Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance. Why do we need the Impact Investing Institute as well?
So it's real alphabet soup out there, isn't it? And that's part of the challenge. People try to navigate through. I think the Institute was formed really out of a task force and an advisory board looking at how we can mobilise more capital. And we're not for profit. We have no profit motive whatsoever. It's all for public good. So we produce free resources that we share. And one of the key things about the way the Institute works is we only focus on things where we're additive, where we think we've got a comparative advantage and can really help. So we work in partnership with many of those bodies that you mentioned, and we form partnerships and alliances, and then we mobilise around a single objective. So why we were formed was that we go right from traditional investment right through to deep impact investing. We welcome everybody and we work in partnership with others. And as I say, we are very, very focused on making sure that we add value in specific areas or support others if we think they're doing a better job than we could.
Talking about working with others, you talked a lot about working with capital.
Yeah.
Are you ever interested in working with labour, the other side of the equation?
Well, we have a lot of pro bono support in the Institute. We have a hard core of a resourced team under a brilliant CEO, Sarah Gordon. And then we have many, many people who devote their time and energy and passion to working with us, whether that's as a sort of lead expert. These are people who come in and work with us on, for example, legal, fiduciary duty, pensions, things like that. And we also have people who will just give their time, space, energy for us. So we do both.
And if someone said, that all sounds great, but it's capital that have created most of the problems in the world in the first place, why do we need more capital to solve them? We need someone completely different, somebody from outside to get on top of these problems.
Well, there's always another model out there, isn't there? You can always say, well, we don't like capital, but the reality is that capital markets and responsible capital is going to be the solution for the future. There isn't another alternative to mobilising capital. And many, many people now are thinking about how can we mobilise capital for good. And you think about it, you've got the environmental emergency, and most people now accept climate change is happening and that we absolutely have to focus on a net zero world. You've got the whole question of the pandemic and the reality that the way it hit was unfair, unequal, and it exposed in society some massive inequalities that we knew were there but had never been as stark. And then today is actually the day we're doing this, is the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. So you have the whole social justice, Black Lives Matter movement on top. These three things are not just now the focus of people in a back room. These are in boardrooms. People are thinking now about the responsibility of capital and the fact that we have multiple stakeholders interested in how it's deployed.
But isn't a lot of what you've described the job of politics and us as voters to solve. It's not the job of a small number of self-appointed saviours in a boardroom.
I don't think they're self-appointed saviours. I think what's happening is that we've got a much deeper understanding now of how capital, private sector, public sector and social sector work together. And if we really want to address some of the major issues, you mentioned the SDGs, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. These are stretching goals agreed to by governments around the world. No single actor can address that, either at a country level or public versus private. The key is how do you work together in concert to deliver outcomes. So public policy, regulation, legislation, rules are all part of this, and we will see regulation and legislation come in to drive change faster than capital markets and private sector might get to, but we actually have to work together.
And when you look at those capital markets, what's more important for impact investing? Is it private markets or the public ones?
That's a great question. The reality is both have a role, and with public markets you've got absolute trillions of dollars or euros or yen or whatever in movement, so you've got breadth. And what's happening through the public markets is, as I said, more accountability in the boardrooms for showing what they can do. But then in private markets you can go deeper and more refined, and you can address impact much more specifically. And the reality is you've got to look at both.
And again, when you look at this nexus of capital, who's more important when it comes to impact investing? Is that going to be the asset owners themselves or the asset management industry and the influence it can exert?
Well, I think one of the things for us all to remember is we are all asset owners. We've got pension funds and savings. Those of us who are lucky enough to save are all asset owners, but often we're a silent majority. We don't actually engage. So I think it's a way of thinking about capital that's very different. So I think asset managers, it's their duty and responsibility to be stewards of capital. In this country, in the UK, we have a stewardship code. In other parts of the world, there are very similar expectations. You talked about the UNPRI. If you sign up to the UNPRI, there are expectations of how you will behave. That is absolutely central to a movement to make capital more accountable and outcomes more transparent. But that gets accelerated by the asset owners, whether that's large institutions, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds or individuals, demanding of their asset managers more action and more accountability. So I see them working both together.
But for all of this impact investing to be properly effective, firstly, do you think there's enough of the right kind of data out there? And also we are sort of sufficiently versed in how to use data properly to draw the right conclusions as to what we're all up to? Okay,
so taking the second bit first, one of the things that we focused on at the Institute is education and awareness. So on our website we have a learning hub, an impact hub, and we're working with organisations like the CFA UK and the CFA Institute to help that information and knowledge be embedded in professional training. We're also talking to financial advisors and some of their trade bodies to say this is a free resource. Integrate it into the sort of certification that you're giving to your investment professionals and your advisors. And then you're absolutely right, you have a trained body of people who can really help to think this through and ask the right questions. So asking the right questions is obviously the starting point, but then your other second question, which was around the quality of data, the quality of information, is knowing when you've got the right answer. And the reality is that there's too much and too little information. There's an awful lot of conflicting information, particularly around, say, environmental impacts. And there's an awful lot of lack of standardized data. So one of the things that we support and are very positive about is moves really in the last year or so towards a converged global standard for reporting on sustainability. And if we can get that, that would be amazing. And that will help companies report on a more consistent basis. Asset managers and asset owners look and say, this is the sort of information we get. Getting to true impact, though, is something else. And you said something very importantly, over time frame. Obviously, some things you can measure within a calendar year, but some impacts take years and years and years to work through. So one of the things we do need to think through is what's relevant for reporting in a sort of annual cycle, and what should we be more patient about and look at over the longer term.
Well, taking that point on, how do you then ensure that people in corporates have got the right remuneration policy? Because if I can do something that seems to tick all the boxes, makes lots of money for the company, but the bad stuff happens in 15 years, by which time I'm retired, I've got my gold-plated pension, and it's somebody else's problem, there's a mismatch there.
Oh, there is. I mean, and that's always one of the classic problems, isn't there? It's true for everything in life, not just in business, but in everything else, you know. I mean, 15 years is a long time, and it's not just about business. How do you know the long-term effects? But I think if you think about what the reaction was to the financial crisis in 2008-9, you got significantly more deferred compensation. And what's been happening, particularly for listed companies, is that you see more and more of the CEO and CFO executive remuneration linked to the medium and long term. There's a requirement to hold shares for longer term. And so I think there are ways in which you can start to get a longer term focus. 15 years is a bit much though. I suspect typically when you look at the tenure of a CEO or CFO, it's 5 to 7 years. But you certainly can think through the lifetime of a CEO or a CFO, the lifetime of a board, to think through long-term returns. And what we're seeing is in executive remuneration, there are now more ESG factors included. And many of those are measurable and monitorable.
Final question, what's one key change that you're working on and hope to affect at the Institute?
Probably our major focus is looking at what's happening on the environmental work, so the transition to net zero, and making it a just and fair transition. So in other words, as we move to reduce carbon, we think about people and we think about communities at the same time. So we're engaging with government, we're engaging with companies to say, as we move to net zero, let's make it a just transition. That revolves down to education, looking at performance of certain asset classes, and if you look at things like the Chancellor in the UK announcing a green gilt, which will have social benefits. So we're working to identify what could be those measurable social benefits as we move to create a greener economy. That could be jobs, it could be community engagement, it could be the quality of lives. That's probably our biggest focus.
We have to leave it there. Dame Elizabeth Corley, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.